By 1235, with the conquest of the Jin complete, the empire now stretched from the Korean peninsula to the Caspian Sea, an area of more than 3 million square miles, a third of all Asia. And all governed from Karakorum, deep in the Mongolian steppe. A capital so remote from the rest of the world demanded a good supply system. The city only existed because the Khan had willed it, so everything had to be brought to it. "500 caravans arrived every day carrying food and raw materials for the army of artisans and builders. There were government records from the conquered lands, and, of course, tax revenues, a seemingly endless flow of them that poured in from every corner of Asia. This was Genghis Khan's dream, the world paying homage to the steppe. With the capital so remote from all its domains, a fast and reliable messenger service was essential to keep Ogedai in touch with his commanders throughout the far-flung empire. Called the Yam, it was made up of riders who traveled day and night to distant outposts on imperial business. The riders wore these large medallions, called pesas, which identified on whose business they were traveling. Most were made of wood or base metal, but some were of silver and gold, testifying to the rank of the bearer. This one reads, "The person using the horse must wear the pesa, or else he will be detained." The fastest couriers were the arrow riders. It was common for them to ride over 200 miles a day for 10 days at a time, sleeping and eating on the saddle. Apart from carrying messages to and from Karakorum, they also escorted important dignitaries. Many a rich merchant boasted that the highways of Asia had never been as safe as under the rule of the great Khan. It was, by all accounts, an astonishing organization. Thousands of post stations were established along the ancient highways. Every 30 miles, a rider would find food, shelter, and fresh horses. If on urgent business, a courier would be swathed in bells that would signal his approach to the station custodian, who would have fresh horses saddled and waiting. The Yam was also the eyes and ears of the Khan, gathering information from beyond the empire's frontiers. By 1235, after the victory over the Jin, and with Karakorum almost complete, Ogedai was ready to plan the next step. He called a Kuriltai, a council of leaders, and here, amidst the dancing shamans, the mandate from heaven was reaffirmed, that God had ordained that the Mongols should rule the world. How this would be accomplished would be revealed, after the generals had conferred for days about the practicalities of world conquest. On the appointed day, Ogedai rode out to proclaim to the multitude that the Mongols were about to undertake what would be the greatest and most ambitious military expedition in their history. Preparations would take another 3 years. The expedition would be led by the great general Subadai, who had accompanied Genghis 15 years before on his campaign. Scouts would be sent ahead to prepare the way. From beneath his canopy, Ogedai ordered the construction of siege machines and summoned engineers from the 4 corners of the empire to assist. Their objective was all the lands as far west as any Mongol horse had trod. It meant the conquest of all Russia and Europe. In 1237, the army set out. Alongside the army were herds of camels, sheep and cattle, plus a huge retinue of Chinese physicians, Arab bridge builders, Persian water engineers, craftsmen and interpreters. Wives and children came too. It was as if the whole nation was on the march. The army had to march for 2,000 miles and cross the Altai Mountains before they could aim for their first objective, the city of Bulgar by the shores of the Volga River. Beyond it lay the rich Russian principalities with their center at Kiev. Before the invasion could begin, the Mongols had to secure their lines of communication. This meant that any threat from the kingdom of Bulgar had to be eliminated. The Mongols were so single-minded that Bulgar ceased to exist. Then they swept on into Russia. To defending armies, the invaders' tactics were baffling. On encountering their opponent, a small contingent of lightly armed suicide troops, known as the Mangudai, would charge straight at the enemy lines. Once they had showered the enemy with arrows, they would turn and flee, invariably drawing the opposition after them in hot pursuit. The Mangudai would lead them to a prearranged spot where Mongol archers lay in waiting. The enemy ranks, now spread out, were easy targets. Volley upon volley of arrows were let loose on the enemy horsemen. The final blow was administered by the Mongol heavy cavalry. But by now, the army consisted of much more than just cavalry. The Mongols were learning the skills of siege warfare, and their tactics becoming increasingly sophisticated. They would need to be, for their forward scouts were reporting that ahead lay an increasing number of castles and walled cities. This is a model of a Mongol ballista, which would have hurled a 100-pound boulder nearly 200 yards against a city wall. The Mongols had conscripted to their cause Chinese and Persian experts who built siege engines and even developed primitive explosives to terrify the enemy. The Mongols also employed the element of surprise. They preferred to attack in the depth of winter, when and where least expected. Life on the steppes had taught them many things. The forward scouts who crossed the frozen Volga into Russia during